It was interesting that the first question David asked me was, do I need to bring a stab-proof vest? Can't think what made you ask.
I've been warned.
Clearly. I think whilst some of us might regard the chance to read the Lymond Chronicles, given the skills and the training that are necessary, might seem a cross between winning the lottery and achieving the Holy Grail, it's pretty clear early on that it might, just to continue the metaphor, be a poisoned chalice. I think we need to remind ourselves, as Betty indicated, that for David, this was a job. Since he did this job, he has done dozens of others. He has not become steeped in the text of Dunnett prose or quotation or whatever. So if he forgets the name of a character, or for a moment a phrase might escape him, please remember that. I think part of our conversation is going to be about the techniques, the expertise, the professionalism that he brought to the task of reading, and part of it, of course, is what he remembers about that experience and what has stuck in his mind and what he thought about it. Some of the questions David may already have tackled in the Whispering Gallery question and answer session, but for those of you who were not around at that time, who are new members or didn't read that or whatever, we may cover some of the same ground today, but it's a conversation, not an interrogation. I was going to begin by asking you what you thought when you first saw the length of the books, but from what we were saying over lunch, actually that doesn't apply. Tell them about the way you got the job.
Very simply, I was doing a job for a producer who said, I've got a series of books you might be interested in. They're historical. Would you be interested? And I said, yes, run them by me. And so I was sent one PDF, the Game of Kings PDF, and a chunk of it. And I sort of flipped through and went, oh, that's interesting. And the bit that I landed on was the section where Mary is at the Lake of Monteath, which is where my family are from, obviously with my surname. I was married on Inchmahome Island, so immediately I went, oh yes, this is nice, I know this. This is easy. Like an absolute fool. So I went, yes, brilliant, bring that on. There we are. And was sent various other PDFs and sort of went, okay, swiping up the PDF. Oh, this goes on. And, oh, that's book one, is it? Okay, so, and book two. Oh, that won't be, yeah, that one's quite long too. And I can't remember how many pages it was, but somebody told me, at a very rough estimate, it's 1.3 million words. Which is quite exciting when you think about it.
So I think you've already tackled what would have been my next question, which is whether, no, it's fine. It's just how far your expectations were fulfilled or not. But I'd like to push the idea of the surprises a bit further. After you'd done Game of Kings and perhaps thought you knew what you were in for, just pick out a couple of the things that surprised you as you came to them and how you tackled those challenges.
Well, partly I have to refer back to the previous question. Partly the difficulty was when you do an audiobook, there's a production timescale. So I get the book and I'm told, if I'm lucky, I have X number of days to prepare, and then we record, and then the hard deadline is somebody else's publication deadline. With these books, I knew there were 6 of them at that point. They were all long and complicated. Unfortunately, I didn't have a huge amount of time to prepare because there was a hard deadline of the 11th of November. And for history buffs amongst you, nothing happened on the 11th of November last year, did it? There was nothing whatsoever going on. So we were, I think the the immediate deadline was going to be the end of September. That drifted slightly by the time we got to the end of book 1, which meant that my prep time was truncated. So quite a lot of it was me reading a chapter or reading 2 chapters and then going back and recording it. So I think it probably worked in a lot of ways. I was able to hit the surprises at more or less the same time as any other reader was getting them. Maybe with a little bit of forewarning because I kind of knew they were coming up. Immediate surprises. Book 4 had a big surprise. That got very interesting because by book 4 I really didn't have any time to prepare. So towards the end of 4 I was virtually. Nora still here? I was virtually sight reading it. So I was the big surprise. Absolutely hit me at the same time as anybody else would have got it, which made for quite an interesting afternoon in the studio, with me going, oh, okay, right. Would this be a good time for a tea break? Wander off and repair makeup.
Now, it is, as we know, some months since you recorded these books.
Yes.
One of the tests of them, perhaps, is exactly what you remember, what does stay in your mind.
Oh, God.
Now, you've just indicated one of them. Do you want to go into any more detail, or would you rather not?
I'm happy to. I just don't want to feel that I've let them down, because my knowledge is now incredibly surface. I think I've done 20 books since I finished those in early October. So it's a lot of it will be grasping at straws. And I'll be saying things like, that bit when that guy was talking to the woman and they did this and everything there. Details, beautiful historical details. I loved the hunting leopards. That was gorgeous. The race across the rooftops was fantastic to do, because it's one of the slightly strange things about doing an audiobook. It becomes like a film playing in your head, and it's as if you're narrating. You're almost doing a simultaneous narration. I'm not putting that the right way. Audio description, better way to put it. A simultaneous audio description for what you're seeing in your head for somebody else. So it's a weird thing. I don't know whether normal readers see it in quite the same way. What other details? I speak some Russian, so all of the details in book 5 were great. That's a very bland answer. The details were great. I love the details. Well done, David. You and your powers of description and imagination. Yep, details good. Stick with the details. All of the stuff around the Kremlin. The description of the houses, how Russia was then, the difficulties of crossing from St. Petersburg. Did they land at St. Petersburg? Yeah, thank you. From Archangel all the way to Moscow, the crossings there, beautiful descriptions. Others shouldn't be ignored, but I just can't remember them at the moment. They will come back to me.
When I was asking the board yesterday for a few inspired questions that I might fire at this unfortunate man, one of the things that came up was the choosing of the voices for the characters. Now again, it's difficult because we don't want to put you on the spot regarding who was who and exactly what they were saying when.
Sure.
But if you could give us some insight into the technique you used when you were deciding on a voice, I think we'd be interested.
There are certain things that I do for every book. The narrator voice has to be me, always, because it's all filtered through my head, but it's also the one that is easiest to go to. It's the one that I've got. The hero's voice, this is not just the Lymond Chronicles, but this is audiobooks in general. The hero's voice is always a variation on mine for exactly the same reason, because I go to it. It's a natural default. It's easiest to get to. The lead female voice tends to be upper or lower, or much higher than mine, but it has to be a sort of a natural, fairly neutral one. It is very difficult when you are presented with somebody like Graham Reed Mallet, who Mrs. Dunnett constantly describes as having the most beautiful voice. Oh, thank you. Oh, really? That's so easy for any narrator. Now, how is it beautiful? Where am I going to go? So I think I just went as low as I could, because it was very different from Lymond's. Lymond's was a sort of a slightly lighter, younger version of mine, as I said. So it made, knowing that there were long conversations coming up between the two of them, it made it easier to do a jump from one to the other with them, because the distance was greater. Philippa's voice was a tricky one, and I struggled with it slightly because I couldn't decide whether to try and do, and I really emphasise try, a light Geordie, because it was tempting and it was one that I could have sort of gone for, and then having missed it utterly would have regretted it for the rest of the time. So didn't, and I kind of aimed for a light-ish standard English, or as standard English as my Scots ever gets. Having had 2 years of expensive drama school training in the dim and distant past that now does me no good whatsoever.
That is interesting, what you were saying about Gabriel, because I thought, I don't know how many people have heard your Gabriel, but I liked it.
Oh, thank you.
Does this sound patronising if I say it sounded like a man who thinks he has a beautiful voice? And I don't mean you. What I mean is that Gabriel...
I think that's probably a very, very fair comment.
Gabriel believes he is a beautiful man, and it comes through the voice you use for him.
In that case, I'm absolutely delighted. I don't know what else I could say. I suppose it's just that thought of, as I got to him, I could hear that line going through my head. The exterior monitor part of your brain starts going off and going, oh, right, remember that bit's coming up, and remember what his voice is supposed to sound like. Really nice, remember? Okay, and speak. So there was probably the slight pause before I spoke made it more thoughtful.
Yeah.
He said pausing and being more thoughtful.
No, I think it's great. And the other villain that really struck me, talking about your English RP, was Leonard Bailey. Did you enjoy doing Leonard Bailey? Because I felt this is the actor, the stage actor, just creeping into the reader a little bit.
I might have luxuriated in that slightly. Might well have done. Quite a lot to play with.
I know. Yes. How many people have actually heard his Leonard Bailey? Do you agree with me that it is rather striking? Absolutely. I know. It is utterly creepy.
I'll have to listen back to it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
A more specific question, which again is a sort of voice-related one. Somebody asked about pronunciation choices. Now, this is a very wide issue, but the one that she homed in on, it was she because there are 8 members of the board, only one of whom is male. You had to make, for example, the choice between invalid cross and invalid cross. And how was that resolved, she asked? And then we can go on to some other pronunciation issues if you want to. Otherwise, fall silent and we won't.
I swithered about it because it could quite easily have been either. This is going to sound like an excuse, and it's not. It's a sort of a vague excuse justification. Because everything is filtered through me, we were talking earlier, and I said that my job is just to serve the text. I can't editorialize however much I may want to. There may be things that I want to point up, but fundamentally, I'm there to tell a story. If I make an error, then it's an error with the best of intentions. Invalid and invalid could have gone either way. I think, as with the use of another word later on, I have a very strong memory of recording both and saying, I don't want to make the decision. Which is me slightly hedging my bets. Did I say invalid or invalid?
The questioner couldn't remember.
Well,
So that's two of you.
I will justify either pronunciation in context because it could have been either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think one thing we all sympathise with is the degree of ambivalence, not to say ambiguity, that runs through Dunnett, whichever of the series we're talking about.
Well, just Lymond and Lymond.
Is that? Yes?
I always defaulted to Lymond just because that seemed natural, but very quickly some people said Lymond to me. And
Dorothy said Lymond.
yes. But she also said she didn't care.
She did,
So,
which is no help to anyone.
well,
No.
I did research.
Was there any decision you made? You've sort of skirted around this one already, but was there any decision you made that you regretted later, that something you might have done differently if you'd had a bit more preparation time or forewarning of the story arc?
Mariotta's voice. I would like to have redone, but because I hadn't started reading book 2 when I was reading book 1, I had to make decisions, and if there was a mention of her being Irish or having a light Irish accent in book 1, I missed it, and anybody who's offended by it, I'm really sorry. Didn't mean it. It's one of those things that I didn't pick up on. Is there anybody else? I'm sure there must have been this is going to sound terribly arrogant. There's nothing that jumps out at me that I didn't like, but then that's the nature of the distance.
Yes.
If I went back and listened to it, I'd probably think, why
how
the
could
hell did I choose that? That's a ludicrous choice, having read it all.
Just out of interest, have you recommended the books to anybody since you read them?
Yes.
Ah.
Lots of people. Thank you very much. And we'll do more.
Now, when you do that, what do you say about them?
It depends who I'm talking to, but I read 6 excellent books with fantastic characters, fantastic historical detail. They are gorgeous on the eye, on the reader's eye, hopefully on the listener's ear, but they are gorgeous to read because they're like a beautiful tapestry. This is like I mean, not that it is a particularly beautiful tapestry, but like the Bea tapestry, there just is this massive, great arc across somebody's life and huge adventures. And as with a very well done television series, you find little minute details that you didn't know, that sometimes you know, on television particularly, or in films, you don't know they're there until you've noticed them. And then once you've noticed them, you can't help always noticing and luxuriating in that detail. I did television, sorry, I'm digressing very slightly. I did television jobs many moons ago where art directors would make sure that the books in the library that you never actually saw were the right books, or that the letters in the drawer that was opened, the first letter would be accurate, but the letter underneath it would also be accurate. It would also be a letter to whoever, and would be written properly, not just the equivalent of written rhubarb, actual beautiful detail. And Dorothy Dunnett puts all of that into her books, and it's that sort of thing that I focus on, because that's what makes it fun to read. Now, you can read a lot of romps, And they're not, some of them are exciting, some of them are less good because they may be slightly more formulaic, but these have such beautiful digressions in them that they're fun to read. And that's what I say to people.
Thank you.
Read it, listen to it. Do both at the same time. Right, tell me what I got wrong.
You were talking about the hero's voice and the fact that Lymond's voice was a younger version of yours. Dare we ask what you thought about Lymond, felt about Lymond as a character? At any level, either as reading him, reflecting on him, looking back on him?
Fascinating and flawed and infuriating and probably exactly the same as everybody else feels. You pick him up and go, "You bloody idiot, why are you doing this?" Or, "Look, she's fantastic." Or, don't do that. You can see that's exactly the wrong way to go. You really? You thought that was a sensible move? So much there.
And finally, before I go on to questions, which I'm sure people are aching to ask you, dare I ask you if you became involved enough to have a favourite among the 6 books?
Not an entire favourite book. Honestly, favourite passages in books. Well, as I said before, all of the stuff about Lake of Monteath, because the rooftops, I like the French court because I like French history, even though I can't speak French, as you will pick up on. Probably. Unless the proofer did a really good job. What else? I liked, is it book 3 that's in Malta?
Yes.
Loved that, because I knew nothing about Malta, so it was a huge learning experience for me. So it's more the section than the book. That's a very bet-hedging answer.
That's fine.
But it's
true.
It's as honest as I'm going to get.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to start the questioning? And can we please have a roving microphone so that questions can be heard from the outset? Thank you very much. Tom, do you feel like leaping about again? Should we try and do it geographically? So if we start with Jane at the front, then you won't have to go from the back to the front and back to the front again.
My question is, how did you approach Margaret Douglas as a character? Because she is such a fascinating, well, to me, she's a very fascinating part of the whole series.
Tentatively. There's, I'm not sure when I started reading how much I was aware she would reappear. So vocally I went haughty because she just presented that. She's, oh God. I'm really going through the mental Rolodex of scenes. May I just leave it at that and say tentatively? I'd love to give you a more detailed answer, but it's mists of time.
Anyone else on this side? So that.
Thank you. Would you read them again for pleasure?
That's the one doubt. Oh, I would read these ones again for pleasure because of the detail. The downside of being an audiobook narrator is I have lost the ability to read for pleasure. It's a great shame, a tragedy in my life, but because it's the job, when I'm reading for pleasure, I now hit the book and start looking at details that are important, but important with narrator head on rather than reader head on. So I start focusing on things like the author's notes about how the person speaks, their physicality, how they move, their physical size, to the extent of the sort of room they're in, where they're from. So I miss the overarching story because I'm honing into the details. I would read these ones again, and will read them again, probably in about a year when I've forgotten some of the details. I've forgotten more of the details that I've forgotten. But yes, absolutely.
I'd like to ask you about one of the characters in the book, probably one of my favourite characters, and that's Jarrett.
Oh, yes.
Your views.
Oh, God, how long have you got? How long have I got? At different times, he felt to me, I feel like I'm going to get shot down in flames here. He felt to me like the angel to Lymond's devil and vice versa. They were, I'm probably hugely wrong, it's how I felt. They were the two faces or two sides of the same coin. There was so much running together. I think if you pushed me, I'd say I preferred Lymond to Jarrett. But Jarrett was interesting to do because he wasn't Lymond. Just read into that what you will. That was an interesting reaction, so I'm not going to go any further. Yeah, excellent.
Right, we're on this side now, I think.
Sorry, I'm giving you terribly imprecise answers.
Without actually asking you to quote any text directly, could you give us an example of how you contrasted Lymond and Gabriel so we can hear what it sounds like?
Well, you'll hear Lymond shortly. Lymond was... I'll give you I always need somebody else's words. If I try and hit it in Lymond's voice, it's not one of Lymond's speeches, but before the draught could strengthen, he had lifted and unstoppered the oil flask. Then, drawing the lamp chain gently down on its light pulley, he filled it and lit the lamp and raised it once more so that its mellow glow touched the tarnished fringe of the heavy canopy. Gabriel's voice would be, reading the same passage, before the draught could strengthen, he had lifted and unstoppered the oil flask. Then, drawing the lamp chain gently down on its light pulley, he lifted and lit the lamp and raised it once more, so that its mellow glow touched the tarnished fringe of the heavy canopy. Was what I was aiming for. You sort of end up channeling people very slightly. For Gabriel, I use as this. Quite often when I read, I will write somebody's name, so the name of somebody that I know, next to the character's name, just as a touchstone to go for. You know, it's this person. My mother's cousin was an actor. He's called Tom Fleming. And I was sort of aiming for his voice when I was seeing Gabriel. I'm not reaching it. Tom's very different from me, but that was what I was sort of vocally pointing at. Doesn't make any difference to anybody but me, but it's just when I get to those passages, you know, I see the face, or I've written Tom, or TF, or whatever. Sorry, I missed the thing about the Flemings earlier. It would have been fascinating.
It was. Absolutely fascinating. Hang on, Shelley. Wait till we get the mic, and then you can hear what you're saying. Thank you.
I don't have your version of audio. I have the other version. I can't remember the name of the guy who... What am I doing it? I'm doing it all wrong, am I? That goes without saying. I don't have your version of it I have the other version that we always had. I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote it. Did you listen to him first before? Oh, only I used to be a standing joke of mine that I worked from home and I used to play all the time because I just wondered if, you know, because if it's pronunciations and things like that.
No, I tend not to because I don't want somebody else in my head when I'm reading it, particularly if they've made a choice that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel that I'm, oh, here's that bit that I'm galloping towards this long passage that I liked. I don't want to mimic. If I didn't like, I don't want to copy. So I tend to stay away from other people's versions.
Yeah, I also found that listening to it, you pick up on all sorts of things you've missed when reading.
Yes.
You know, and things like, thank you.
I first read the books as a teenager, and I'm very bad at languages. So our hero's tendency of going off and quoting poetry in many languages, that must have been fun.
If by fun you mean misery, I'm very fortunate in that when I finished recording, I recorded all these at home and sent them to a producer who then passed them on to a check listener. And I had a wonderful check listener who sent me back pronunciation notes. And then I re-recorded everything that I mispronounced. And there were quite a few. Things that I thought I knew. It's a slightly weird thing when you're reading out loud for a living. Your brain, because you're reading about half a sentence to a sentence ahead, your brain is always recreating the words that your eye has just seen. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you follow
Yes.
me? I mean, basically, your eye's ahead and your brain's reconstructing. I don't know whether this is true of everybody. I imagine it is, but my brain reconstructs what it thinks it should have seen, not necessarily what it has seen. So you end up stumbling, or in order for your brain to mouth connection, not to stumble, your brain then says what it wants to have heard. So I would go charging into a passage in Latin or Spanish or French or Italian or any of the other languages and go, oh yeah, I get that. Yeah. No. And then the checklist would come back and go, oh, right. So pronunciation note. So they were, they caused me hours of tears and frustration. Nice to do. I mean, when I listened back to the finished, the little bits of finished version I heard back, I thought it sounded quite good.
It did, yeah.
Which I don't always think of me.
Next question.
Yeah, hello, David. I was going to ask you if there were any English words that gave you any problems in these books.
English words?
Yeah, because I find I have to look stuff up in the dictionary when I'm reading Dunnett to find out what it is and how you say it. Did that happen?
And yes, what on earth that very old word meant. I'd love to be able to give you examples, but honestly, there were too many. There really were. With that book, I was reading from a very large iPad, and I had it on split screen a lot of the time with my pronunciation notes as I picked up on the bits of prep I was able to do. When it wasn't on my pronunciation notes, I was on a dictionary, but just because it was easier. You know, keep the dictionary open, that way you're not having to close everything down to open it up. She had a fantastic vocabulary. Yes. Puts us to shame.
One more question, I think, before we go on to the readings. Two. Kirsten's got one as well.
You said briefly that you would reread the Lymonds. It's okay, I always get shot every year for saying that. Would you read any of her other books, like The Nicolas or King Hereafter?
Can I say probably? I might buy the audio version. I might buy the audio version because I know John Banks very well and he's done a fantastic job, as you will all hear when they're finally released.
Last one, Kirsty.
Now, you've been talking a lot about how you did the characters and approached sort of the dialogue in
Yes.
that sense, and obviously being an actor, that's probably natural to think of, you know, the roles people are in the book or
Yes.
that first. But obviously a large part is the narration itself, the language of the book. So how do you approach that, and do you get a sense of the flow of the language, or or peculiarities of a language, and how did that strike you in general, or not even just Dunnett, or in audiobooks
In
himself?
audiobooks generally, sorry, I shouldn't go across the mic. In audiobooks generally, the narration I find is the easier bit because it's written in a voice that I'm not having to find. It's the glue that holds everything together. Other narrators have vastly different opinions. It's one of those sort of weird, it's a green room question. You know, we ask each other, what did you think of this? How does it work? Dorothy Dunnett's use of language is so good that she actually makes it very easy for a reader and a narrator, to some extent, to read. But the complexity of the language gives you hurdles that you weren't expecting. And lists. Oh, I love a list. How long does this list go on? We seem to have read 3 pages of list, with many different, varied and unusual words in it, which led me to say many different, varied and unusual words in response. And frustration.
Thank you very much for those questions. And now I think it's probably time to move on to your readings.
I will read at you.
Give yourself a moment of preparation.
Oh, you're right. The reading I'm okay with.
Whoops. Sorry.
Am I safe to put this up here? Thank you. This is from chapter 5 of Checkmate, when Lymond is visiting a lady, an elderly lady. Francis Crawford embarked on his search and completed it, neglecting nothing. And if he had any natural feeling, none was visible. Even when, as he was finishing, the candles finally expired, he showed no surprise, but closed the last drawers in a marquetry desk without hurry, and turned in the shadows to look at the long crowded room and the high chair at its end, still illuminated by the small fiery star of the oil lamp. Across the dark spaces the monumental candlestick shone dusty gold, and the chessmen glimmered like moonstones. Less bright than either were the folds of brocade which charged the seat of the chair and fell from it, tarnished brocade which stiffly coped the still kneecaps it covered, and lay in stony scrolls about the slippered foot on the dais. The half-open hand on the blio held no sceptre, and there was no crown on the regal head which stared from the canopied blackness, only a hennin set on 2 coarse golden plaits which lay within the red veil of the lamplight. The Dame de Dudance's chair was once more occupied, and the cold, running, drenching through all the room, told of anger as the lightless eyes, without movement, stared straight into Lymond's. His hands closed. Then, his back very straight, he walked slowly forward until he stood, as before, in front of the dais. There he halted. In the dim ruby light, his hair glowed like silk seen through a wineglass. A breath came from the chair, bearing speech with it. Aucassin. I am here, Francis Crawford said softly. And not afraid? The whisper was harsh. Of many things, but not of the grave. Within the cavity of the chair, nothing moved but sound, and that barely. Les beaux, les blondes, of what are you afraid? Came the whisper. Search my mind, Lymond said calmly. It is open to you. The chair was silent. Below the threshold of hearing, the other dead forms in the room, touched by air and by warmth, seemed to stir faintly, waking. The man, unmoving, gave no appearance of heeding them. So it seemed untoward that presently he should flinch without warning, so that his chin should lift and his face harden, like that of a man threatened by enemies. From the chair, loud and harsh, and not in a whisper at all, came a long, contemptuous cackle of laughter. Then the whisper said, as if nothing had happened, You are forsworn. You should fear me. This time he did not answer at once, and when he did, it was carefully. He said, I am here because you willed it. I willed, said the seated figure, that all I owned should be yours. You have wronged me. He said gently, Had I done otherwise, I should have wronged Martha. Who is Martha? Like a powerful snake coiled and striking within the chair, the voice hissed and cried, loud as a street call, Sut, putain, traficus, have I died for this? He did not speak. The lamp burned. Then softly the voice said, in the old threadbare whisper, Martha is a vagabond. You have learned pity. You have met evil. What, Aucassin? What of love? This time his voice of its own accord was quite steady. I have learned love as well, for a nation, said Francis Crawford. For no person, said the voice from the shadows. For no person, said Lymond, assenting. If Martha is a vagabond, who is Gazelle? A snigger came from the chair. Then the whisper said sharply, The mistress of Dmitri Ivanovich Vishnevitsky. And what, said Lymond softly, is your name? The room all about him stopped breathing. Then from the chair rose a singing vibration, like the note of a tuning fork, or a voice humming in madness or pleasure. When it came, it was the loud voice that spoke, coyly muted. You know, you see, you cannot quite keep me out. You know. Ah, that is Camille the Volscian, he said abruptly. I know, you will harm her. And the voice, threadbare again, said, You speak in riddles. What would you ask me? And then, loudly, He will not ask. He is afraid. I will ask, Lymond said. Who is my sister? The faint voice, sighing, answered him. You wish to know who you are. Many men go to the grave without that favor. You are the husband of Philippa Somerville, and under cursing will remain so. Do you hear me? Do you hear me, both of you? She is outside, Lymond said. She is at your elbow, said the whisper from the canopy. A voice laughed harshly. His face blanched. Francis Crawford swung round from the dais. Behind him, Philippa stepped from the murmuring darkness. The distant light textured the floating brown hair and drew glints from the absurd fluted stomacher. Her face, high-browed and burnished, looked up at his without fear. "I am of the loyal cranes," she said, "that stand round the king at night holding stones in their feet. Love, fear, and reverence, write these upon the 3 stones of the cranes." She smiled at him gravely, and, turning to the tall chair under the ruby lamp, spoke to it. "Accident joined us. Why should any such marriage be binding?" The young, fresh, practical voice rang through the room. Round the chair, the air became dead. When the next words came, they were slow and faint, and addressed to Lymond. "I have promised your grandfather..." Lymond said, "My grandfather is dead. And what did you promise concerning the marriage of Martha and Gerrit?" The voice was cold. "Did the woman Martha promise love?" "She promised kindness," said Lymond. Behind him the room spoke, in a sound as fine as the stretch of a ligament. "Gerrit Blythe has had kindness," said the still, sexless voice, and chilled them with the breath of its disdain. It deepened. "Have you learned nothing? You should have died with the dog. The bond will endure. Swear to it. The marriage will stand. Swear to it. Speak my name." "Camille," said Lymond. Behind them there came again, far away, the small sound of movement. The voice rang, "Keep me with you." "I am with you," said Lymond. The sound came again, louder. Philippa looked at him. "Then swear." The voice altered and rolled, rebutted from corner to corner. "The marriage will stand. I have your mind in my palm. I will crush it." "Then do it," said Francis Crawford. "I renounce the bond and the marriage. I defy you, Camille. Do us harm if you dare." "No," said Philippa suddenly. A wand of pale light, dropping through the powdery air, fell slanting beside her, and accepted the contours of the cabinet and dewar and ciborium. Her hands on her skirts, she swept round and saw what had caused it. Jarred by a monstrous and uneven thrust, the bronze door behind her had begun to swing out on its hinges. It opened slowly, shuddering, and the boom of it rose and fell like a mustering wave in a sea cavern, gathering resonance with its momentum. Philippa heard Lymond shout, pitching his words through the clamour, but she did not hear what he said, nor did the man on the threshold. Wide-shouldered and powerful, silhouetted against the flickering light of the candlesticks, Gerrit Blythe found the resonance in his wrath of Assurbanipal. But fiercer even than that was the shrieking voice from the chair, overpowering it. "Swear! Swear! The marriage stands, or I will curse you, Francis Crawford." Then the swinging bronze door reached its terminus. It thundered into the wall, and the shock of it rolled through the room like the hoofbeats of the Volscian squadrons, splendid with brass, and clashed in the skull like its bucklers. "Francis Crawford," said the powerful voice, "in fire is your friend, in flood is your foe, in powder is your release. Remember me." C'est fini. And slightly lighter, from Game of Kings, Part 5, Chapter 2, I seem to have written on it, which is remarkably detailed for me, when a Spanish gentleman turns up. The door burst open, the tapestries flapped, and a human tornado enveloped in a whirl of depot-stamped canvas and trailed by protesting soldiers erupted into the room. The visitor brushed off his escorts, slamming the door in their faces, and strode headlong to Gray's desk. "Madre Dios, caballeros soelladas, su venganza, ladrones!" Hissing, the newcomer fixed his lordship with a burning eye. and even Lord Grey had to admit the magnificence of his rage. He sido mortificado, insultado, hombre. Me hecho as... Oh, I love these books. Me hecho asimere. Mirame! Screamed the insulted one, and peeled off the canvas. Mr. Secretary Miles, tried beyond endurance, gave a soul-destroying quack. Dudley and Grey, pinned to the petrified edge of diplomacy, gazed at the sorry remains of a ruffled shirt, pleated and trimmed with shredded bullion, hair once black, oiled and curled, swooning from a coarse woolen cap, askew, and below bare thighs, blue with cold, and tarred and feathered from toe to knee as a duck goes to market. A single destitute earring winked next to the high-bred nose and smooth olive skin. Lord Grey, recovering an aplomb he had hardly known for a month, rendered sympathy, concern, and indignation in a mollifying buzz. By a combined effort, he and Dudley got the still detonating visitor into a chair, rewrapped in Dudley's cloak, and his feet in a pewter basin of hot water to melt off the tar. He was brought a pot of mulled wine and invited at last to address himself to Mr. Miles, who spoke Spanish. The caballero was displeased. "But," he said, with some hauteur, "I speak the Scottish perfecto." "Oh," said Dudley, taken aback. He, Grey, and Miles waited. The Spanish gentleman inspected his feet, sat back, and proceeded to prove his point. He introduced himself. Don Luis Fernando de Córdoba y Avila, leader of the captured supply train, and said much about his relatives on both sides. He referred, in passing, without deference, to His Majesty the Emperor, to the noble and adventurous life of himself and a few compatriots as masters of their own swords in London and Flanders, and drew their attention to the proverb, "Un hidalgo no debe a otro que a Dios y el rey nada." Mr. Miles was anxious to translate. Grey restrained him. "I can guess." "De veras," said Don Luis politely. "My lordship has the true Spanish lisp of Castile. His Spanish sin duda as much good as the mine." At this point, discretion came to Mr. Miles, and he studied the floor. "And now," said Don Luis. He rose splashily to his feet. "To action, señores. Mas vin cuatro ojos quenoros. If the señores will lend clothing to myself and my men, with your aid we shall follow and kill the animals who put the hand on us. By el engaño, the trick." The dark face flamed with renewed vitality. "The leader I wish to meet. The confusion with the horses, the skillful overcoming of such a man as me. There is no man mediocre. Ay, Dios y cuanda, when I meet him..." "You may meet him now, if you wish," said Grey calmly. "We have him and most of his men locked up here." "¿Qué pasa? How is this?" Lord Grey saw with satisfaction that the caballero was impressed at last. "Pero, ¿cómo así?" They explained. Don Luis, the ends of his cloak slopping in the bath, stood in astonishment. Then he swept out of the tub, imprinting the carpet with black, sticky footmarks. "This terrible Signor Huil, lead me to him." "Signor, wait a moment," said Grey sharply. Don Luis paused in the middle of a characteristic rush to the door. Grey said, "You don't by any chance know how the leader was called?" "But of course," said Don Luis simply. "Do you not? It is Don Huil de Scotia." Don... Dudley suddenly experienced a terrible nostalgia for the King's English unadorned. "He can't be called that. He's a Scotsman." No. Don Luis was annoyed at his own stupidity. "This I translate to remember. El nombre de Pia." "Christian name," said Mr. Miles surreptitiously. "It is Huil. That is, in Scottish, oil. An unusual name, is it not?" said Don Luis, amused. "Oil?" said Grey, rather hollowly. "And the patronymico," continued Don Luis with undiminished helpfulness. It is delle Scotia, of a Scot. Scot, said Gray, his face suddenly lightened. Wait a moment, Scot? That's McClue's name. Wheel. It's the Spanish pronunciation, idiot, not the English. What sounds like wheel? Will. Will Scott, McClue's oldest son. Idiota? Said Don Luis stiffly, picking out the insult unerringly from the maze of multisyllables. His feet, a tarry mound, were ringed with pools of water from the cloak, and his eyes were narrowed at Gray. Idiota?